This will be a bit different for my subscribers. I know you're here for my theater and musical theater discussions, but I need to share something off topic. I loved Thor, Love, and Thunder. Loved it. But based on Marvel fandom and critical reception, this seems to be an unpopular opinion. Let me backtrack a bit. For about 6 or 7 years, I ran a blog and podcast focused on reading through the Marvel Earth 616 continuity, starting from Fantastic Four #1 in 1961. I personally read up to the early 1990s. That's a lot of comics, and it's safe to say I love them. I love their wild, niche appeal and the fervent disregard for reality. They embrace chaos, and that's okay. However, I don't love comic book movies. They're often too grounded in reality. There are no gods, aliens, and Morlocks interacting in a bar, just real characters being real. Why would I want to see this? Superheroes are weirdos in wrestling tights. There's nothing real about that. Sure, sometimes this approach works. The Dark Knight comes to mind, as well as the Constantine film starring Keanu Reeves, which was faithful to the soul of Hellblazer, aside from the pronunciation, which I always read as Constantine, but also totally different. But most comic book movies strip away the chaotic soul of the comics to create more approachable stories. This started to change recently when Marvel began exploring its more outlandish characters like the Guardians of the Galaxy and the world of Doctor Strange. They began to embrace that chaotic spirit. But as they did this, fans started turning away from the films and shows, feeling alienated. Ironically, this is when I began enjoying the films more. Although they only capture maybe 10% of the comic's craziness, they're becoming more faithful to the source material. I believe that despite the poor reviews and fan reception, Thor, Love, and Thunder closely embody the spirit of the comic books. As comic book movies embrace their roots and strangeness, mainstream audiences might pull away. This is inevitable because, despite what the last decade has shown us, comics have always been a niche medium. Their recent broad appeal stems from a sanitized version of the original material. Now, the critical reception of the movie highlighted both its strengths and weaknesses. On the opposite side, Natalie Portman's portrayal of Thor received praise, as it was a nod to Jason Aaron's recent comic series. Christian Bale's Gore the God Killer also garnered positive attention, despite being a relatively new character in the comic world. However, many critics found the story lacking in substance, criticized Thor's portrayal as plodding and foolish, and had mixed feelings about Russell Crowe's Zeus. Fans on various forums expressed disappointment that the film was not as openly gay as they had anticipated. They were unhappy that Brunhilde's, or as the movies call her, Valkyrie's sexuality was not prominently featured, while others felt the movie was too woke. These criticisms often stem from a misunderstanding or a lack of appreciation for the Marvel universe. Thor, in the comics, was never intended to be a deeply complex character. Created in the 1960s as Marvel's answer to Superman, he has evolved over time, but has never been known for depth. Characters like Spider-Man or Daredevil typically carry the weight of the more profound storytelling in Earth 616. Personally, I enjoyed Russell Crowe's portrayal of Zeus. In the comics, since the late 1960s when he appeared, Greek gods have been depicted as self-indulgent and frivolous, contrasting the more serious Asgardians. Regarding the concerns about the film's portrayal of Valkyrie and the woke elements, it's important to note that Valkyrie has always been depicted as a lesbian since the mid-1970s in the comics. This aligns with Norse mythology as well, where shield maidens are often portrayed as lovers of their fellow shield maidens. The director may have used the term gay for promotional purposes, but it aligns with the source material. The term woke has become controversial. But comics have always addressed significant social issues, from fascism to civil rights. Marvel Comics, in particular, have been at the forefront of these discussions, with the original X-Men symbolizing the civil rights and later the gay rights movements. Therefore, it's fitting that these films continue to reflect the socially conscious spirit of the comics they are based on. One aspect of the comics that this movie captured well is Thor's somewhat superficial character. In Norse mythology, Thor is a hedonistic warrior who enjoys drinking and revelry. In contrast, Marvel's Thor is portrayed more like Superman, a righteous hero championing the greater good with a clear understanding of good and evil, reflecting Judeo-Christian morals. However, Thor is also different from DC's Superman because he's partly a parody. Many of the early Silver Age characters created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby were parodies, including Thor. Unlike Superman, who was raised as a human and understands human society, Thor struggles to fit in. Although he was stripped of his powers and lived as a mortal for a time, a retcon from the original idea where Thor's alter ego was a doctor named Don Blake, this didn't help him fully understand humanity. Thor's quest for a spiritual connection with the Guardians at the beginning of the movie is appropriate for his character. His heroism, combined with his flippant attitude towards Jane and others, is true to the comics. Thor is often shown as somewhat aloof, similar to how Alan Moore depicted Dr. Manhattan in Watchmen. With immense power and near immortal lifespan, everyday life becomes trivial for Thor. The movie also accurately reflects Thor's relationship with Jane Foster as it unfolds in the comics, highlighting his aloofness. While this aloofness was played for laughs in earlier films, it isn't particularly charming. In the comics, Thor's lack of care is often a character flaw. Audiences familiar with the film version of Thor, as a charming hero, might find this more comic-accurate portrayal to be off-putting. When Warner Brothers proposed making a film adaptation of Batman in the 1980s, many assumed they would be adapting the campy 1960s television series starring Adam West. The studio aimed to distance themselves from the comic books, and director Tim Burton even admitted later on that he had never read a comic book in his life. Although the film's designers drew inspiration from Frank Miller's darker Batman, being associated with comic books was considered lowbrow and geeky. This bias persisted in Hollywood throughout the 1990s and into the early 2000s. However, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man films marked a shift toward taking comic book source material more seriously. Raimi's Spider-Man, though different from the comic version, retained its essence. Over time, a distinction emerged between comic book movies and movies based on comic books. For instance, the aforementioned The Dark Knight and Constantine were praised for their quality but were not faithful adaptations of their comic sources. Despite this, these films boosted comic book sales. The release of Iron Man and the birth of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or the MCU, demonstrated that comic book movies could succeed by embracing the quirks of their source material. Films like Thor, initially considered risky, proved to be blockbuster hits. The Avengers further dispelled fears about sticking close to comic book roots, although some corporate resistance remained. DC and Warner Brothers never fully embraced the strangeness of their comics, and Sony's approach was inconsistent. Meanwhile, Disney, known for its magic and whimsy, began to incorporate more of the weirdness from comics into their films. Doctor Strange marked a turning point despite not performing as well in North America, and Guardians of the Galaxy was a major success, suggesting that audiences were open to more comic-inspired themes. However, the failure of the Eternals raised questions. Was it too mythic or too weird? Should Marvel play it safe? These questions linger in the minds of MCU executives to this day. Fans appear conflicted about the balance between embracing comic book weirdness and mainstream appeal. For instance, the second Doctor Strange film had to avoid being too strange, and the Submariner's character was altered to fit contemporary themes in the second Black Panther or Wakanda Forever film. Yet, Thor, Ragnarok, showed that comic book strangeness could be successfully adapted, leaving fans more excited and confused about the future direction of comic book movies. Although fans were excited about Thor Ragnarok, something odd was happening in the movie business. The once guaranteed box office success of anything labeled Marvel was fading. Fewer fans were showing up for the subsequent releases. Several factors contributed to this decline. The pandemic changed how people consumed entertainment, with many turning to streaming devices like Disney+, which made it easier to watch movies at home. This shift may have led to audience saturation. Additionally, as Marvel adapted more material, it struggled to keep the films grounded in reality. In the 1990s, executives wanted Marvel's intellectual property mainly for merchandising opportunities, not because of a deep connection with the core fanbase. With the introduction of the multiverse in Marvel films, terms like Earth 616 and continuity became more prevalent, appealing to hardcore comic fans like myself, but alienating casual viewers. Comics have always had a niche appeal. They began as satire in the mid-1800s, evolved into a medium for racy and violent content, and by the 1930s introduced the first superheroes. These early heroes, like Batman, were more grounded and relatable. Comics were shared among soldiers, college students, and young boys. Women also read comics, including the early racy ones, often in secret. The history of comics, intertwined with countercultural movements like early women's suffrage, isn't studied enough, but reveals that the medium has subversive roots and that women have more influence over comic book history than often talked about. When critics describe comic book movies as incoherent and strange, I welcome it. The strangeness and complexity inherent in comics are finally being reflected in their film adaptations, making a departure from the sanitized versions of the past few decades. This shift might alienate mainstream audiences, but it's a return to the true spirit of comics. To my subscribers, thank you for watching my video on this topic. Although I no longer run my blog on this subject, I still sometimes need an outlet for related work. While mainstream interest in superheroes seems to be shifting, my passion for comics as literature remains strong. Thor: Love and Thunder, despite its mixed reviews, stays true to the spirit of the original comics, embracing a messiness often absent in typical comic book films. If the mainstream loses interest in these films, we might see a smaller, wilder comic book world emerge. This wilder world represents the future of comic book movies. I don't believe comic book movies will disappear. Instead, they might become less frequent and more niche, finding homes in the corners of streaming platforms. As entertainment becomes more fragmented, it will create vast opportunities for various film experiments. I see a bright future for comic book films, one that I didn't see a decade ago, with new niches flourishing as a result of this shift. And if you like conversations of this nature, then why not subscribe to my channel here at Julian Munns? You might also notice that I run an acting school. You can actually follow the clips down underneath the video and take a look at what sort of acting lessons that I do offer. You can also see that I am fundraising for my own opera of Paradise Lost, and it would be great if you could toss me a donation either through PayPal or through the link for the Buy Me a Coffee link. That would help out immensely. But if you can't do any of that, then just a like or a subscribe or a comment would help me immensely. Until next time, I remain Julian R. Munns. Thank you for listening.